A NASA composite photo of the South Pole, and all those wavy things are the depressions which run around Antarctica. There is nothing to stop the wind. It just goes round and round. And so it's quite difficult to get there by ship, and even more difficult in some circumstances to get there by plane. So I'm going to tell you, amongst other things, a little bit about the voyage down there, as well as a bit of the science. A bit of background, there is an Antarctic treaty which says this land can only be used for peaceful purposes and for science. And all of those nations have signed up to it, which is a really good thing, I think. It clearly has potential reserves of oil and goodness knows what, but for the moment it's hands off just for science. And the most science that's done down there, of course, is all to do with climate change. This is actually one of the big ice shelves taken by satellite from the Antarctic Peninsula. As they always say, it's about the size of Wales, and it's in the process of breaking off. And a lot of what happens down there is a kind of temperature gauge of what's happening in the rest of the world. As the ice melts at one side, in fact, it's building up on the other side. But the history of global climate change can be read in Antarctic ice by drilling down through the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of years that ice has been there, and analysing what's in it at different stages. So that's the really important science. Ours is rather sort of attached to it, but of course people have to live down there while they're doing this science. There are very, very few permanent inhabitants. Most people go down for a year to 14 months from Britain. Some people opt to go down for longer than that, 2 years, and some people go down, very few in fact, for much longer. And one of the things I realized when I was lucky enough to go there was that once you've been once, you immediately want to go again. It is absolutely fantastic. There is no doubt about that. There are some so-called permanent inhabitants because on one of the Argentinian bases, they actually have taken pregnant ladies down there so that there are genuine Antarctic citizens, so I'm told. So they are closed, isolated communities. Capsule living, they call it. Very hostile environment, and the light conditions truly are extraordinary. The base that I've been involved in is at 75 degrees south, and it has 3 months with no sun at all. The sun doesn't rise in the winter, and 3 months when it doesn't set in the summer. It just goes round and round the sky. So why is that important, you may ask? Well, each of us has, and stop me, by the way, if I'm incomprehensible. There'll be time for questions at the end, but if it gets really difficult, please stop me, and I'll explain better, I hope. We each of us have an internal clock in our brains. In fact, I don't want to upset you, but if you take this bit of the brain out of a rat and put it in a dish and record its electrical activity or measure what's in it, it generates rhythms all by itself in a dish. So it's a clock in a dish. And we have one too. It's quite small, but it's very important. And it governs our daily rhythms and to a large extent rhythms such as menstrual cycle, and we're not quite clear yet about the seasonal rhythms. And it is not on a 24-hour cycle, this clock, in most of us. It's usually slightly longer than 24 hours. And this means that if your clock has to be in sync with your environment, you have to reset it every day, just like a watch that is running too fast or running too slow. And the main resetting agent is light. And if you don't have enough light, there are lots of problems. Because we are a diurnal species, we've evolved to sleep at night and be active during the day. And we've all heard of the 24/7 society, so that many people have to work in the middle of the night. There's light pollution all over the place. And we are messing up our internal circadian rhythms by this extra light at the wrong time. That very bright bit up there is the Belgian motorway system. But apparently it has reduced the accident rate enormously. So there's good and bad in all of this. So because you need a regular light-dark cycle to stay in sync with 24 hours, these are the sort of things, situations that cause problems. And by far the worst one is shift work. It's essential because, of course, emergency services, hospitals, transport, banks have to work 24 hours a day. But each time you do a night shift, your body clock is in the wrong state for working at night. Jet lag is the one that gathers the most media attention, particularly around January when people are booking their holidays, because it's a transport across many time zones. Your clock can't keep up. It takes approximately a day for every time zone that you travel across for your internal clock to catch up. And in the meantime, you're out of sync. Dim light in the Antarctic winter. Blindness, I'm going to tell you a bit more about, because this is, I think, very obvious how important light is. Sleep disorders and old age. Is all this fairly clear? Yeah, okay. This may not be. This is what you might call a typical chronobiology slide. And I'm going to sit down because I need to point out to you what it is. It's a diagram of sleep in an individual. For example, it could be an animal as well, but let's say it's who goes to bed every night around midnight and gets somewhere around 5 o'clock in the morning in this case. And this person in the top of the slide is in a normal environment with light during the day, dark at night. They get up approximately the same time every day. If you put them into an environment where there are no time cues of light and dark, and they haven't got any other time cues at all, normally people will get up later and later and later and later until they're getting up in the middle of the day and going to bed, getting up in the middle of the night and going to bed in the middle of the day. And it just carries on getting later. The vast majority of people do this if they don't have proper time cues, and particularly light, dark time cues. A very few will actually get up earlier and earlier and earlier. And have you heard of larks and owls? Well, the larks are the early ones who would get up earlier with no time cues, and the owls are the ones who get up later, and most of us are owls. And I think most of you will know that we tend to get up later on Sunday morning and go to bed quite late on Saturday night, so that by Monday morning we're somewhat out of sync and rather a bad mood. Does that sound familiar? Yes. Okay. But just to show you in somebody who can't help it, this is a man, a totally blind man, with no light perception at all. That's very important because most registered blind people do have a bit of light perception. And during this period, this is his sleep, wake, and it's repeated, sleep, wake. It's repeated across to show the rhythmicity, okay? During the green bit, he was told that he could go to bed and get up whenever he felt like it, and as you see, he gets up later and later and later and later all the time. And during the lower bit, he was asked to try and live a normal life on the 24-hour day, and he manages to keep his sleep approximately at the right time, but by no means all of it. But can you see that running through that record, there's his internal clock, which hasn't managed to synchronize because it hasn't got the light-dark time cue. And for really totally blind people who have this problem, it's like having intermittent jet lag. Now, of course, this is a potential problem in Antarctica with no sun. And the health problems of disordered rhythms, in other words, rhythms which are not appropriate to the life, the environment that you want to work in, so you're in night mode when you should be in day mode. The major one is certainly sleep deprivation, poor alertness, performance, digestion, increased risk of accidents, mood problems, and increased risk of heart disease and cancer in shift workers. Mood problems, this, I was asked initially about winter depression and talking about that. But in fact, it's really quite rare in Antarctica. First of all, because it's a largely male population. Women do go now, but it's still largely male. And SAD is a female problem. It's about 80% female, the disease. But also, of course, they are robust, healthy, young, and they've gone there because they want to be there, of course, so all of that helps. But it is really quite rare. It's also rare, incidentally, in Iceland, which has incredibly long nights, and you would expect Icelandic people to get terrible winter depression. But they don't. And even when they move to live in Canada, they still don't get winter depression in northern Canada. So there's clearly, it looks as though there's a genetic component to this. But there are other problems. This is just to show you a little bit what the light is like at midnight at the summer solstice. That's me, just to prove that I really did go. And that's midday at the winter solstice, and that glow on the horizon only lasts for about, well, a quarter of an hour, half an hour. Right, apart from Anne, who I know has been to Antarctica, has anybody else been in the audience? No. So this is all fairly new, is it? Okay. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to get there, then talk a little about what we've done about the light, and I'm going to show you quite a lot of, very quickly, some pretty pictures of icebergs and things. Okay? Now I went by ship on one occasion, all the way from north of England, down across the equator, down to Montevideo in Uruguay, then to the Falklands, which is the jumping off place for the British Antarctic Survey to go to the British bases. And then we wandered around the Southern Ocean, delivering cargo and people to various islands and outposts. And it took about 3 weeks, thoroughly enjoyable. And in the process of doing it, the captain of the ship said, well, why do you want to go to study sleep and light in Antarctica? The crew of the ship have terrible sleep problems. Why don't you study us? So I applied for a grant and got a grant to study the ship and go down again. So that was pretty nice. It's an icebreaker, the one that the British Antarctic Survey has two. I think Anne went on the other one. This is the Ernest Shackleton, and you've all heard of Shackleton, I guess, and hopefully some of you will have seen the film. She's not very stable in very rough seas, and we had some very rough seas. We had hurricane force winds on 3 occasions, crossing from the Falklands to the peninsula. And also we were loaded up with, I think it was 3,800 barrels of aviation fuel, Avatar, which is what the base use for fuel because it doesn't freeze, fortunately. And it was, you know, it was good fun. The worst bit, by far, was the crossing the equator ceremony. I don't know if any of you have done that, but you have to come up before the court. There's King Neptune, who is always a woman, and Queen, is it Nefertiti? Something like that, who is always a man, great big bone boobs, and the judge. And you have to confess your sins. And as on this occasion, I was actually studying the rhythms of the crew, and we collect lots of samples of urine in order to do this. My sin was taking the piss out of the crew. And of course, you're always guilty. And the punishment, well, this was a particularly severe punishment. That is fermented kitchen waste being tipped over one of the crew's heads. It was his first Antarctic crossing, equator crossing. The rest of us got a soup ladle full of it, and then we were hosed down. Then very briefly, Falkland Islands. I haven't really got time to talk about them except to say they're very windy, very nice, a bit like England 50 years ago, and it's terribly hard to distinguish the sheep from the tussocks of grass. Can you see that this is grass in the foreground and sheep in the background, but it's all very similar. And these are the various bases that Britain still has. We gave up quite a few of them because we couldn't afford to run them. Rother is the main one, the big base. It has a runway, which I think you can get in all the year round if you absolutely have to. Halley is the one that I've been involved with. I think Anne may talk to you about Sky Blue. And Halley is really rather remote. It took us a good 4 weeks to get there from the Falkland Islands via the South Orkneys, the South Sandwich Islands, and South Georgia. And I'll just show you a few pics at this point. These are grounded icebergs in the South Orkneys. This is the ship icebreaking, and the crew absolutely loved icebreaking because what they do is they rev up the engines and they head straight for it until the bow comes up over the ice, and then the weight of the ship breaks the ice. They use the bow of the ship like a brush and dustpan to get the ice out of the way. And then she revs up and does it again. And this goes on all day, all night. It's very noisy, and everybody's out there taking photographs. And if you look at the broken ice, you can see the basis of the food chain with the marine algae of various colours, different layers, that the krill live on, and then the seals and whales and so on and so forth eat the krill, etc. There were seals lying around, of course, on the ice. When we got to the South Orkneys, there were lots and lots of penguins, but I won't go on about penguins. I didn't realise how many varieties of penguins there are until I went there. There are apparently 12 different varieties of penguins. Those are called chigstraps for obvious reasons. And the icebergs are absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Easily the most attractive thing to see down there. This is South Georgia. It's like the Alps coming straight up out of the sea. Skiers say it's the best skiing in the world, but there aren't any lifts. You have to climb the mountains first before you ski. That's Grytviken, where the war with the Argentines started. They're plastered in wildlife. This is a baby wandering albatross. He's just learning to fly. Another wanderer, an adult. A lot of you will have seen David Attenborough's films on albatrosses, I should think. Yes. The bird on the right-hand side is a giant petrel, and they are rather unpleasant. You see the tube in the nose. Well, it will sort of spit at you out of it, and it doesn't smell very nice. and sailors call them stinkers. And loads and loads of seals. They were hunted almost to extinction in South Georgia, but their numbers have fully recovered. These are fur seals. There's an albino who's quite rare. They're quite savage, in fact, I have to say. The first thing they do is you get off the rib, the inflatable boat that takes you ashore. The first thing they do is give you a large stick and say if a seal comes anywhere near you, hit it, because they have large yellow infectious teeth and they bite. So then pack ice, you have to make your way through it, and finally we get to the coast where the base is. 75 degrees south. It's the most southerly of the British basin. Its fame is it discovered the ozone hole in 1985. There's quite a story behind that, but if anybody wants to know, I can tell you afterwards. Coldest, windiest, sunniest, and if you go as British Antarctic Survey personnel, you have to accept that you will not be evacuated if you are ill, because normally it's inaccessible from March to late October. It has happened that someone's been evacuated, but it involved an American plane which could, there is a skiway there, which managed to land, and it couldn't let its engines stop, because if it had, they would have frozen, they wouldn't have been able to start them again. And they did manage to evacuate somebody like that. So these are courageous, young, adventurous people who go down there. But from a research point of view, they're wonderful, healthy, robust, normal volunteers in the same environment. And well, I was actually asked if I would like to give the base doctor something to do, because the base doctor doesn't have a great deal to do with robust, healthy, at the time it was young men, in 1984 when we started. And so you might as well, or she it is these days, quite often, I might as well do a research project. This is Christmas Eve, midnight, arrival on the sea ice, and back of the sea ice you can see the shelf ice. The sea ice melts every year in the summer, but the shelf ice does not, it changes much less. And all the cargo has to be transported across that sea ice, up onto the shelf, and to the base, which when I was there was around 11 kilometres from the shore. That's how you get off the ship. I don't think health and safety would have improved particularly, but it was a very efficient way of getting off. And one of the first things you see is the emperor penguin colony at Halley, wandering around at that time. Now, this is Scott's expedition. I expect you saw something like this if you went to see the film this morning. How they managed, I have no idea, but we were equipped with most wonderful clothing, with layers of silk and boots called mucklucks, which went down to minus 40. If it was minus 40 outside, your feet were still warm. But by the time you got it all on, and when I was there at any rate, I was actually too hot. And you could see people working in t-shirts when there wasn't any wind, but it was sunny. It might have been below zero, but it was possible to work outside in the t-shirt. Most people got to drive a snowcat. I certainly did the first time I was down there, which was the main transport. And you travel from the ship to the base, these 11 kilometres, over flat white nothing. And the snowcats only go at about 10 miles an hour, so it's quite slow. So you see nothing but whiteness in all directions. And then there's this tiny little dot on the horizon, and that is the base where you're going to spend the next year of your life. And that is actually quite an overwhelming thing. There was complete silence with the guys and girls that I was with as we saw it and then arrived there, as it sank in what they'd let themselves in for. At the time, and it has changed as you'll see shortly, it was an orange box on sticks which could be raised every year as the snow accumulated. But one of the problems with having this base, Halley, on an ice shelf is that it moves. And it moves around 700 metres every year. It moves towards the coast, and then it falls off into the sea. And so this one was built, first of all, to be jacked up, and the latest one is built so that it can be moved, and it's not going to drop off into the sea, one hopes. There's a post office and very desirable stamps from down there, of course. That's what it looks like as the sun begins to disappear. If you want water, you have to dig it into a milk tank, and if you fancied a long shower, you put a few more shovels full in. And now we come to a bit of science. Now, this is what I showed you with regard to the blind man before. Do you remember? Where if you've got time cues, you stay on 24 hours, and if you haven't, you drift away from 24 hours. This left-hand diagram, it's one person, it's triple plotted, so that's repeated across just to show the rhythms. This is sleep and wake. There are 3 periods of night shift there, and you can see that people are sleeping during the day and awake at night. But what I want you to notice is that throughout this period here, the sun is below the horizon, and although this guy, and it was a guy, gets up with an alarm clock at the same time every morning, at the weekends he has enormous oversleeps, something like 6 hours, 8 hours before he can get up. And that's his clock trying to delay, like the blind person I showed you. But on British Antarctic Survey bases, there are strict routines. You get up, there's a base commander, and it's actually quite military in some respects. You have breakfast at the right time, then you go to work. You work 9 till 5. You have lunch, you have tea, and you go to bed at a reasonable time if you don't have to get up in the middle of the night and do the meteorology. But there's a Greenpeace base, or there was, where they didn't have to do any of those things. And all 4 of the people on the base, there are 4 people there, there's the period the sun is below the horizon, and they desynchronize all the way through that period that the sun doesn't come up. Oh, and just by the way, there were 3 guys and a girl on this Cape Evans base, and each person has their own natural period when they divert from 24 hours. It's a genetically defined thing. To start with, these 4 people, free ran it's called, desynchronized with different periods, and then the girl shacked up with one of the guys, and they then did it with exactly the same period for the rest of the period of sundown. And you could call that sort of social synchronization, I guess. These days, those were sleep diaries I just showed you. We use this lovely little gizmo called an ActiWatch, or an Actigraph by some people. And you'll see in some of the exhibitions outside records from one of these, or more. It records movement, and in this case, light. Every minute, or whenever you program it to record, we normally record movement every minute. And you can wear it for weeks and weeks at a time and get a continuous record of your personal life or somebody else's personal life. And it makes long-distance research very possible, for example, in Antarctica. By looking at the movement, you can determine whether people have slept well, because their sleep will be fragmented or it will be consolidated. You can tell when they went to sleep, when they woke up. And it's extensively used now in sleep diagnostics and in sleep research. But they've also been out in space on astronauts to see how they sleep. They've been on reindeer in Lapland, etc., etc. So they're very useful. And I just thought you might like to see, in addition to the tapestries out there in the exhibition, what an actual scientific record, if you like, looks like. This is one person in Antarctica. There's all the movement and then the sleep, and then it's repeated movement to show the rhythmicity. The black is the movement, the yellow is the light. This is somebody who is a fairly normal sleeper, although you can see there's a big delay every weekend. You see that? Now, this person, that person, has a problem. And again, this is an Antarctic record. They have had fairly irregular sleep during this time here. There's the movement, there's the rest, there's the movement again. And then they do a week of night shift. And this puts them completely out of kilter, and it takes them weeks to get back to a normal sleep time because of the poor time cues, poor synchronization. So if we sort of summarize, some people, I did say SAD was very rare. Real SAD is rare in Antarctica. But a lot of people, in fact, have low mood and feel tired in the spring. And it's been called subsyndromal SAD. But the most obvious problem to me is that many people wake and sleep late in the winter. And there, I haven't got time to go into this, but there's a major delay of the whole internal rhythm system, circadian rhythms. And we look at this by looking at the hormone melatonin in either saliva or in urine. And some people really can't live on the 24-hour day at all, and they will desynchronize all the way through winter, and this is very disruptive to the basis activity. If you've got somebody, one person actually went out and slept in a tent out there in the winter because he was sleeping at such peculiar times of day. I won't go into night shift, but we knew then that extra light treatment would probably treat all of these problems. And the amount of light they were getting at the original base, it was really low. So we set out to give them more light. And because, well, we actually started doing this in '84, but more recently, blue light has become kind of very interesting because there's a specialist system in your eye which differentially responds to blue light and is rather powerful at controlling things like sleep and rhythms. And so we've looked at blue enriched light and white light on Halley with Philips lighting providing the lights. Each person got a light box, and then there were light boxes all over the base as well. They look pink, the two of them, but in fact that's full spectrum white light and blue enriched on either side. And I wouldn't dream of, I'm sorry about the French, if it says French, no, it's not French. I had some French lights, but never mind. I'm just going to say that after a lot of work, we conclude that the sun is best, but if you give people extra white or blue, it had beneficial effects on their sleep timing, on their circadian rhythms, and probably on their mood, but we haven't done a lot on mood because nobody has been really depressed. And the maximum amount of light we think you need to see is about 2,000 lux. You've got about 30 lux in here, this is not very much. 2,000 is what you see sitting next to the window on a bright, sunny spring day. If you go out on a sunny summer day with no clouds, you get 100,000 lux. So we spend most of our time in a light-deprived environment, in fact. You need around 2,000 each day, possibly every other day might work, but we don't know yet, in order to stay properly synchronized. And 1 hour in the morning may be sufficient to maintain sleep, mood, and performance in these polar regions. So that's the sort of sum of our observations recently. But I was very pleased that the architects, the lighting architects of the new base, which has just come into operation this year, took light very seriously and has equipped this new base with the possibility of changing the spectrum as well as the intensity of the light, and so that people can get enough nice bright light. There it is, that's the new base. If anybody wishes to look further into it, there's a lot of interesting information on the British Antarctic Survey website. You just have to put British Antarctic Survey into Google and off you go. And it's designed, as I mentioned right at the beginning, to be movable and pushed away from the sea as it drifts towards the sea. And there's just a few more pretty pics. I think that's the new base on a very cold time in the winter. There are other problems than darkness in the winter, because this is what the aurora can look like. And of course, whenever there's an aurora, people rush out and get quite a lot of light, and they don't get much sleep, so not much you can do about that one. There's also the problem of midnight sun, because it's very tempting to go skiing in the middle of the night. I think a real problem is the lack of visual stimulation at this particular base. It's flat white in all directions, pretty much. I'm finishing in about a couple of minutes, is that all right? Yeah? I'll just tell you a little story about this slide, because those are fuel drums. They're empty, they're black, and they're every 50 meters from the base to the sea, so that you can find your way. And in a whiteout, you actually need string as well. And every so often, a penguin appears at the new base, which is very odd, because penguins like to live by the sea. And there's a theory that the penguins by the sea see the last black fuel marker, and they walk up to it and say, "Oh, look, there's a penguin." And when they get there, it isn't a penguin. But then they saw another one, so they go to the next one. So eventually, they arrive at the base. Next one. You take to looking at tracks for visual stimulation. That one in the middle is a penguin on its tummy, and that's a penguin standing up. And then, of course, there used to be a lack of ladies. Women only went down to Halley for the first time, I think, in '95. And one of my base doctors thought he would measure the libido of the guys down there while they were on Halley base during the year. And this is unpublished information, you're very privileged. But there's a lot of people, there are 16 people took part in this, and they rated their libido on a scale from not at all horny to very horny. And this is the whole year, in fact. As you can see, it goes down and down and down. There's midwinter, and it flattens. But before the ship gets back and they head off to the hotspots of Rio, it starts to come up again. So there's an anticipation of future pleasure, let's say. Another problem is, of course, that people like doing silly things like abseiling down crevasses. I've nearly done. Just let me show you this. This is on the way home. It's one of the South Sandwich Islands. It's called Zawodowski. It's known as the Stinker because it's a sulphurous volcano. It has 2 million chinstrap penguins on it. That's the vent. And all around it we saw black icebergs, which the crew had not seen before, which were quite extraordinary. There were those completely black ones, there were stripy ones, licorice all sort ones, absolutely amazing. South Georgia, there's Shackleton's grave, and finally I'm sure you were expecting more penguins, but there's quite a lot there. I'd like to thank the British Antarctic Survey because they've supported our research down there from 1984 to last year, and I believe we have to thank the Wellcome Trust, but
which doesn't seem to be on the last
doesn't
slide,
seem to be there, unfortunately. We're very grateful to the Wellcome Trust. I personally am, because they funded a fellowship for me for so many years, in fact, but also particularly for funding Shuffle. And thank you for listening.